The average person sees 3,000 commercial messages every day. How will your message cut through that? By being the best.
That's what my first boss said to me when I started working in the advertising industry back in 2003. I've got a competitive streak, and I got pretty good at it. But then, it hit me. 3,000? We're telling ourselves we're consumers 3,000 times a day. What does that do to us? I'm not just talking about overconsumption, generating massive amounts of waste and huge environmental impact. What if consumerism is not only a material problem? What if it goes deeper? And it's actually a psychological problem. Those 3,000 messages a day embed a story in our psyche. They tell us the world is a contest, and our role is to compete with one another to thrive. They tell us to care only about ourselves and to expect everyone else to do the same.
So today and this morning, we are so happy to have Jon Alexander with us. Jon Alexander has written a fantastic book called Citizen, challenging the way society looks at what we do and even structures across the globe and how we got into these structures. But what I'm not going to do is attempt to explain it. I'm going to go over to Jon and say thank you again for coming. Can you tell us what Citizen is about? Because we have a younger audience, and that younger audience maybe don't know so much, and it would be really good for your information to be given in layman's terms.
Let's do this. No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, first of all. So the core idea of the book and all of my work really is an offer of a way of understanding the moment we're living in, really. And I talk about there being three stories of the individual in society, and that we're in a moment potentially a pretty major shift. And I think it's really important that young people going into the world right now have a way of seeing this moment so that they understand what they're going into. And I love what Urban MBA is doing in that context. But so my thing is, I talk about, like I say, three stories of the individual in society. And it's easiest introduced as a kind of historical thing. So end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, the dominant story was what I call the subject story. And so the subject story says the right thing to do is to keep your head down, do as you're told, get what you're given, on the basis that there are a God-given few who know best, and they'll lead us to the best outcomes. That is the right thing to do because it results in the best society. And look, this is a pretty screwed up story, right? It's the story of colonization, of patriarchy, and at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, it began to fall apart. Industrial revolution, rise of the middle class, it became harder to sustain a story that said that there were a few who should be in charge of everyone else. Out of the two world wars and through the second half of the 20th century, we constructed more or less deliberately, we as humanity, a new story that said I call the consumer story. And in the consumer story, the right thing to do becomes to pursue self-interest. It's to look out for yourself, to choose the best option for you from those that are offered, on the basis that individual self-interest will add up to the collective interest. But that's how the best society will result. And what I believe is happening right now is nothing less than the kind of collapse of that logic, just as the subject story fell apart before. And I think it's because you can't solve the challenges of our time from within the logic that created them. You can't solve crisis of loneliness and mental ill health from within a story that says we're independent, isolated individuals. You can't solve crisis of inequality from within a story that says that competition is the way that everything gets better. And you can't solve ecological crisis like climate crisis, nature crisis, from within a story that says we're separate from nature and that success is material standards of living and so on. And in that moment, as the consumer story kind of falls apart, two things are happening. One is that the subject story is back. I mean, that's how I understand, like, the strongman leader, the Trumps and the featherless world. And the other is that something really powerful could be emerging. And this is what I call the citizen story. which is a logic that actually is much older, much deeper, and has probably survived more strongly in the cultures of the less powerful, the marginalized, because it has had to. But the logic of the citizen story says the right thing to do isn't just to do as you're told, nor is it just to pursue self-interest. It's to get involved. It's to contribute your ideas of energy and resources to the pursuit of the best outcomes, and to reimagine and maybe even recreate, like build new institutions, governments, businesses that actually are designed to tap into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone. And so that I think we are in a moment of really significant shift, and being prepared for that world, not just like, we are not going to live in the same world in over the next 10 years. Things are going to shift dramatically for all sorts of reasons. And understanding that and being aware of it and seeing what some of those dynamics are and might be, I think is vital. And so and I think we do have a choice about it, but we need to be ready for it. It's a huge part of what I admire about Urban MBA is how it's sort of looking into the future and taking on some of those challenges.
So if I was to ask you, and sometimes I would say that these are sort of conspiracy theories, has the power not shifted maybe from one area to another? Because if you have a look at things like the World Economic Forum, right, and they're predicting where the world is going now, and I think that the whole reason why we can't become citizens is because the way they narrate things going now is designed to make us not work together in order to go for. But it seems that we're on rails at the moment.
Yeah.
And this stuff is already predicted, and we have nothing, we don't really have a say in it from my perspective in terms of what, how do you feel about that? And would you say the power structures are maybe not slightly similar if I've gone into a different hit?
Yeah, no, and I think we are very stuck right now with it. And like if you put it into political context, like so many elections around the world don't really feel like a choice, actually. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Or if they do feel like a choice, they feel like a choice between stick or twist, where both options feel dangerous and terrible for a lot of people. I mean, and I'm not pretending that they don't feel a lot more dangerous and terrible for people who don't look and sound like me as a posh white boy, right? So, but let's just be clear about that. But they are, so like example. So the way I see a lot of what's going on politically around the world is that people are being offered only the options of stick or twist, and stick is manifestly terrible and can't face the challenge of our time because it's just more of the same. And twist currently is strongman leader, is the subject story, is kind of fascism, basically.
Yes.
And so I do think we're very stuck. And I think in a way, like there sort of has to be another option. And when I look around the world, a lot of what I do in the book and what I'm now doing off the back of it is I'm traveling around the world and meeting people from across the world who are starting to build that other alternative. And my favorite story in the research of the book was the way Taiwan responded to COVID. Like the Taiwanese actually crowdsourced their national response. They announced the 3 design principles to their national response would be fast, fair, and fun. And they set challenge prizes where the tech community created apps that would track face mask availability and case outbreaks, and even the civic tech community built the track and trace app. Wow. In that country. And they even set up a phone line where anyone could ring in with ideas how the country's response could be better, and little kids rang up with ideas that got adopted. But the key thing about that is that was actually arguably the world's most successful response. So because they tapped into the ideas and energy and resources of everyone, because they made it feel like a team effort, it didn't just feel like it. They had the second lowest death rate anywhere in the world, and they never actually went into full lockdown. And so their economy thrived relatively as well. So when these things start to emerge, there is and if we can name them and tell the story of them, which is what I'm trying to do a lot of, and others are doing as well, I'm not claiming to be the only one, then we start to see that maybe we can take these challenges on differently. And we start to say to the kind of the stick crew, the sort of the status quo, the rails that you talk about, like, all you are doing, you folks on the rails, is you're making fascism inevitable. But there is another way. And so I think, and what I imagined in that world is that we can invite everyone to be part of the conversation about how do we want AI to land in our societies, right? Like, what do we want the parameters of it to be? Do algorithms need to be open source so we can actually understand what's going on with them? What do we want the access to technology to be? How do we want to govern so that the wealth that is being generated is distributed differently? Because, like, the concentration of it in this moment in time is utterly obscene. Yes. And so I don't, like, it feels like the world is very stuck. And I think, like, moments of stuckness through history, moments of intense stuckness have often come before really dramatic change. And I think that equipping people with the skills and the awareness and the ability to kind of be, like, what's the word, like, be able to sort of speak the language of the future. If more people can do that, then there's more different people from different backgrounds can be part of those conversations and demanding to be part of those conversations, then we have a better chance of shifting that logic.
So there are two things that have gone on over the last 2 years, as an example, that or 3 years in this country, that maybe challenges some of the things that you're talking about.
Yeah.
So as an example, the UK have been testing the universal basic income program for 3 years. We've had some young people here, and you've seen that we've got young people here who are doing, they have no idea about what's going on in technology.
Yeah.
So, they're at 16 and 17, they're about to go into their full careers, and they've just come out of school, John, and they don't know the whole shift is happening. So we're not getting it to them early enough for them to even have a say in this conversation about whether it becomes open source or not. And we're also doing tests in the universal basic income. You talked about all the government changes last year. There was something like 64 governmental changes at the top last year in terms of what's happening across the globe. And all of these people seem to be coming in at the same. If we take a look at Labour as an example, it feels, they're here now, but it feels no different to anything that has happened before. And I suppose my question to you is that there has been a lot of talk about these changes and whether you go strong on, and that. Is there a mechanism that you could think of that would allow that to happen a lot faster? Because none of these guys know that they either go working on the universal basic income, and it might be something that happens. And also that we're going into a world that's being predicted of just rich and poor.
Yep.
Right. What's your maybe response to some of those things?
So, I mean, in terms of the world we're going into and the work of kind of preparing or practicing for the future, rehearsing the future, which is what I think, as I understand it, a lot of what Urban MBA is about. In some ways, I think that the work is the same regardless, right? Like, if we are heading into the sort of, I agree with you, the default, the path that we're on, the way that the rails go, is into a future of serious inequality. And the risk of it is that those who are in positions of power and influence at the moment retain that power and influence because they, as you've said to me before, they invest in the next technologies, they own the next technologies, they retain all of the power. And if that world is going to come about, then the way we need to practice and prepare for that and try and mitigate it is by equipping young people with a different set of skills, with the language, as it were, the metaphorical, like, to be able to, like, play in that world and have a chance of having some of the power at least. And if we really do that work really well, and we spread it and we scale it, and this thing called the windfall trust that we were talking about off air, like organizations who are looking to find ways to break open the hold on power that is there at the moment. If we can do that work really well, then we might be in a place to go, actually, we can create citizens' assemblies and participatory democracy structures around the world that can give us a chance of resetting and reshaping, so that we really do embrace some of these like emergent ways of doing things. And that's a much more exciting and much more positive world. But the work from where we are is kind of the same. Like we need to skill young people. We need to give those from marginalized backgrounds an ability to speak the language of the future, so that they can force their way into those conversations. And that work is valid regardless. If my great hope is that I guess part of how I see my role, partly because, frankly, as I've alluded to already, because the body I'm in and the voice that I have, right, like is I get allowed into some of those spaces. I was in Brussels last week at the European Parliament.
Wow. Okay.
And I maybe can play a bit of a role in saying to folks in those systems, you have to open these institutions up now. You have to hear the voice of young people and folks from marginalised backgrounds and people who are trying to learn the languages of these things, that of indigenous folks. Because if you don't, then the only other alternative is fascism. And that message is kind of landing with the folks who are on the rails, right? Like, there are people in the worlds of the World Economic Forum and so on who understand that what they're doing is no longer working. Like that, and I think there's something about seeing that, like the end line, the tagline of the World Economic Forum is committing to improving the state of the world. I mean, I'm not a big fan, right? But
Neither am I, but I think bring that up because we know that they are right a lot of control there.
Right, there's so much power there, and they are scared of the rise of fascism, right? And so if you can say there's another way, then maybe we can get ourselves onto that step change future where actually power is much more distributed. And I don't claim to be like incredibly optimistic that it's definitely going to happen. And I think that the work is the same regardless.
We're seeing them, to your point on fascism, when we're in periods of austerity, it comes up. So Italy,
yeah,
fascist prime minister is going that way. France, we're sort of getting the same type of thing. And we've seen the rise of it more and more. Would you just say it is economical more than it is the fact that there's because, period of Brexit here, we blamed other cultures taking things, and then that's why it pushed us into these areas. Whenever there's periods of austerity, the marginalized community get hit the most in terms of all of that. And why I ask you these questions is because they seem like there's not really any change, and we're actually getting a bigger rise across the globe because of the situations that we're actually in.
Yeah, I mean, I think the economics certainly creates the trigger points, but I would argue, I think that, like I say, so my view of this moment in time is that it's this moment when the consumer story, the logic of that story isn't working anymore. So the idea of everlasting growth isn't being delivered, and ever increasing material standards of living isn't being delivered. And that means wealth is starting to be concentrated rather than everyone being on a rising tide. It's increasingly obvious that's not the case. And in that moment, that creates the opportunity, but I don't think it actually does it all. So because that is happening, then the strongman leader, the fascist or whoever, can say, don't trust them, don't trust the establishment, trust me, I will fix it, and do as I say. And also they tend to say it's not actually, the problems aren't systemic, the problem is those people. It's generally pointing at someone who looks a little different, prays a little different, and by blaming they create their in-group, out-group, and so what I'm saying is what I'm really saying was the economics matters, but in some ways, but it's really about the power. And if we can, and as I say, I think those in the position of power and influence at the moment, in this stick or twist dynamic, the people in position of power and influence at the moment think that they are trying to protect something. And by trying to protect it, they're actually pushing people into the arms. Because those people in position of power and influence at the moment are trying to somehow pretend that things aren't broken. They're refusing to acknowledge the brokenness. They're refusing to validate, and entire generations, young people in particular, are having they feel completely mystified when I talk to young people. Like, how are these people not acknowledging that it's screwed, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of young
That's why I always wonder. It's so obvious when people are in here and you're just like,
how, and so young people are going, and it's no wonder that a lot of young white working class folk in particular are going, there's this phrase conservative realism, which is basically a sort of a version of inverted commas realism that says that the world is going to be dog eat dog, so I'm going to look out for my egg. And they're calling that, they're not doing it because they want to, they're doing it because they feel that that's the only way to deal with the future. And that's so dangerous. But when you have people as I say, people in position of power and influence trying to act as if they're in control and they know what they're doing and that all the problems are manageable, that's the reaction you're going to get. And so, but the opportunity lies in the fact that a lot of those folks in what we might call the elites, and I acknowledge myself to be, like, demographically at least Caucasians, are really scared of that and are starting to see it. And if we can give them another way of dealing with that, by actually opening the doors rather than closing them, by like holding the space to go, how do we want this to work? If Labour, like, really make it tangible, if Labour in this country, like, take the energy, like, there's this mission to make Britain clean power by 2030. If the way they did that was to go, let's have a community energy revolution. Let's have like small scale renewable energy across the country. We're going to support that to happen, and we want communities to come together to do that. And we're going to put a citizens' assembly, randomly selected, 100 randomly selected people will be, like, representative of all key demographics. So as many, proportionally as many young black people in that as a proportional in the population. We're going to make sure there's a voice for that rather than it being the usual suspects. They will be part of the governance of that. They will steer that mission. And you would then go, like, this is something the country is up to together. They could do that tomorrow, and it would change the story of who we are. Or another really tangible example, I think back often to August last year, August 24, when the riots happened. And if you remember, on the Wednesday night after the first round of riots, there was a list of 100 places that the far right where they were going to attack.
It leaked from us, I remember that, yes.
And do you remember how many people turned out to defend those places?
It was crazy. So obviously Wolfram So was one of the really big ones, and there was a whole load of people out there. Wolfram So's not too far from here. So you're right. They all came out and said, we're waiting. And it was really interesting. And it was, yeah, we're going to protect these places. Yeah, we're not going to let this happen. Yeah, and imagine if the next morning, what Keir Starmer had done was to make a speech where he said, this is who we are. We're a multicultural, multiracial nation of ideas and energy and beauty. We're not a far right nation, and we've just shown it. And we're going to build a future together. I think that speech wrote itself. Yeah.
Actually. And if he'd done that, I think that the moment that could have been created, the energy that could have been invited in, would have been so positive. And I don't think, like, I guess the reason why I use those two examples just to start to illustrate is I don't think we're that far away from a very different society. Like, because if you start to take those opportunities, and then others in other countries start to take those opportunities, and then we start to go, hang on, do we really want that line of white dudes, white tech bros who were in the front row of Trump's inauguration? Do we really want them deciding the future for all of us? No, actually.
Yes.
So, and again, I emphasize, like, that is not necessarily in any of our power to make that future happen. And even if we are on the track to very unequal worlds, the work is the same.
Yeah.
Skill up, learn, figure it out, understand these new technologies, understand the context that's coming, and be prepared to work in it.
So you mentioned some of those organizations a minute ago when you were saying about these tech guys and all that, and you did talk about organizations in these bigger organizations, your big Googles of the world and everybody else, some others, who are currently sort of running the world. What do you think their impact and what should we do? Because how much influence are they having? And is it about them that's really shifted a lot of the narrative or the change?
I mean, I think there's huge power in the tech heroes, right? And we shouldn't be naive about that. And I guess that in some ways staring at them, so there's a couple of things we can do, right? Like at a micro level, it's still the fact that like what these platforms do is make us into our own media brands. Like you and I are both editors in chief of our own media brands. So we can choose what stories we tell, what stories we find, what voices we amplify. And there is agency in that. We choose what we pay attention to still. It's very hard to, well not, but we do have that choice. And if we find each other and start building something different, then we still have some agency. And then the other thing I would say is like, we create a different future, not just by staring at where the power is now and kind of protesting against it. We create a different future. So the backstory of Taiwan, that Taiwan crowdsourcing, the backstory of that is a hacker movement, originally, who called themselves Gov0. Because what they did was they built parallel websites to government websites that all had URLs ending G0B.2W.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's mad. Yeah, and they made these things really participatory, so you could upload and download budget items. There were conversation menus that you could download and discuss what government were talking about at home and with your mates, and it wasn't massive, but it started to grow. And then when things really changed in Taiwan, there was a protest. Because the government tried to rush through a trade bill in mainland China, there was a protest, and then Occupy-style protest, and the Gov0 movement got their tools and a broadband connection into the parliament where the protesters were occupying, and the protesters started using those tools to show what a different kind of democracy would be like. Okay, and the reason I tell that story now in response to this question about like big tech and how much power is there is to say, well, that is where the power is. And like we can still build and organize together to build different power sources in our communities. And like often the most marginalized folks still have the strongest sense of community and can be the heart of those processes. The thing I'm most excited about in Britain at the moment is a campaign called Our House. And what these guys are doing is they are working in support of community groups around the country to crowdsource what they're calling people's trust. And the idea behind people's chapter, so the inspiration comes from a worker movement in the 1840s, which was called the Chartists. And what those folks did is they came up, conversations going on all over, they came up with a list of 6 demands of how the rules of democracy should change. Okay. And they didn't like attach it to a particular political party. They were outside of the party structures. They just said, we want these 6 things to happen. Things like MPs need to be salaried so that anyone can be an MP, not just someone who's independently wealthy. And these folks, the Our House campaign is essentially doing that again, a 21st century Chartist movement, saying, like, if you think about democracy or our society a bit like a football match, right? Like, it's not just that we need slightly better players. It's not even that we need to pick a different team to support. It's that the rules of the game are broken. And so work that is at the level of like, how do we crowdsource? How do we decide? It's in our gift, like, still just about to say, no, we need that rules. And I think that campaign, and it's happening, some of the first experiments are with the refugee community in London, with a community group in Grimsby and East Marsh, and a group in Northern Ireland, and so it's not coming out of the existing power structures. It's coming out of unlikely places, but in a way that's exactly what needs to happen. Right? And if we can start to wed that together, I think something really exciting, very powerful could happen.
So we need many more of these groups. And I always tend to think that the reason why it maybe doesn't come out in marginalized communities, because they're always thinking about how they can make money, because it's so divided in terms of that. And the number one thought is that, so trying to get people together to then create these communities like our house, and maybe, because if we had so many of them all across, things would change, right? And that's what you're talking about. But always that they were poverty.
Yeah.
And your first thought is, how can I get survival mode is what doesn't allow us to do this. And so that equality in getting all of that across is what's more worrying for me, is that if we're predicting a world of just rich and poor, and no middle class anymore, we're still not going to be able to get to that community thing, because people are just wanting to live or wanting to survive.
Yeah.
And maybe to a point, and that's what makes it very difficult. Is there, this is a crazy sort of question, but is there any way, or would you think we could dismantle the monetary system?
I guess so I hear you, and I also acknowledge that, again, it's very easy for me to say, with my kind of pleasant upbringing and my relative security to a lot of the people who will be listening to this, but I do think, and I think the evidence through history is that, like, when the challenge is a systemic one, like this, when the challenge is bigger than individuals, then individuals have to find each other and find collective agency. Like, just figuring out how to survive yourself is just going to pass the problem on to the next generation, and the next, there's not going to be a solution. And we're getting to the point where, and through history, we've seen, the founding of the cooperative movement, black mutualism in the US, the civil rights movement, and often these movements have, come from within marginalized communities that are going, we have to do something different. Like, we got to the point where just trying to survive by the rules as individuals is a losing battle.
Yeah.
And we have to find a different way to fight the war. And again, I'm not saying, like I say, I know that's easy for me to say, and I think it's truth. But yeah, monetary system, we're going to blow it up, Kofi. Is that what we're doing?
Well, I just think that it's the thing that creates the power, right, for people to then rule everyone else, because those people with money can just dictate. And even when we're looking at these organizations, I think when you look at the way that money is spread around, most money ends up at 5 or 10 organizations at the top, right? So no matter what money you get out there, whether you go and buy food and it ends up like at Amazon and you buy some, it always seems to get concentrated at that particular area. And it makes it practically impossible then for those changes, to your point, to be made. Because I look at, when you look at what's happening in the States with the DEI as an example, diversity, etc., and I've seen the same thing happen time and time again. So we now get a strong arm guy coming in here and he's saying the best guy to get the job should get the job. Now, we already knew the best guy was not getting the job, and that's why they created those rules. He's then gone and dismantled it again. And then we go back to stage one all over again. And it always boils down to these particular situations, but it always, in my opinion, always boils down to money. It also always boils down to, I think that when we're looking at people from marginalized communities, it will really never change, in my opinion, unless we do it ourselves. And to do it ourselves, we're going to need money. And then that's why the system doesn't ever move from where it is.
Yeah.
And I'll just give you one point before you answer that question and we close, is that I grew up watching through that period of hip hop.
Yeah.
I grew up with the NWA and the whole shooting incident around that time to what we then got with George Floyd again, maybe 30 years later. Well, when we're looking at change, I don't see it because I grew up seeing the Rodney King incident, Indy beaten up. We're now enlightened beings, 30 years, we're in a period where AI and everything else and the same people are getting killed in exactly the same way and no real change. So if I'm honest, as a marginalized community person, I don't believe it will ever change unless we change it. But that will also ever change unless we've got the money. And that's why I asked that question.
Yeah.
Is there a system that's better suited to what can maybe provide change?
I mean, I think the answer actually is that the different system is the we do it ourselves system, right? Like say, and community wealth building is a growing movement where pay for institutions, so hospitals and public sector organisations and so on in a place start to procure all of their key stuff locally, and that keeps money circulating in the local economy and starts to build something. And there are really interesting work going on with that all over the world. I was just actually weirdly on a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere in Montana. And my life is weird, but the North London is about the least exotic trip. But so these guys are working with the local indigenous populations there, and they bought their own food processing plant. They combined 5 ranches, and they're shifting the ownership models of those things so that more marginalized communities in those areas are part of it, buying their own food processing plant, start opening restaurants, and they're keeping it all in, rather than, to your point, like what used to happen would be that they would farm the land and then they would have to send their stuff off to a mega business to be processed, and then that mega business would send it to other mega businesses who run the restaurants.
Yeah.
And along that chain, all of the money disappears out of the local area and out of the local communities and out of the marginalized folks in those communities and the genuine neighborhood, and instead ends up in the pockets of shareholders of mega business. But that model is happening on a cattle ranch in Montana. It's happening in Cleveland, Ohio. It's happening in Preston, in Lancashire. It's happening in lots of places, and it's really growing. And in the Basque Country in Spain, it's flying. And so there is a hope that in all of these sort of elements, but as you say, it does come back to we are going to have to do it ourselves. And maybe as a closing thing, I think that if I come back to your thing about change and the possibility of it, and honestly, man, I hear you. I can't imagine. I will never be able to truly understand what it would be like to be a young black man watching Rodney King and then be a mature black man watching George Floyd. Same thing at that. It must have been incredibly painful to see and be. And I guess I just go again back to this thing. I wouldn't have expected to see things get that much better, honestly, over the last 30, 40 years, because I think the last 30, 40 years has been part of this 80-year arc of the consumer story. And I think the change that is possible now, as that story is manifestly broken, in Brussels last week, I had a conversation with one of the politicians. So I spoke at this conference, and the politician who followed me tore up her prepared speech because of what I'd said and engaged in an argument with me.
Wow.
And that was I was like, oh, huh. And we had a chat afterwards, and she's invited me to go and meet her and talk more, because she was she was like, I don't agree with you, and I yet was how I read it.
Okay.
But she was willing to engage because she was going, oh, you are calling out that if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to end up in fascism, and I do see that. And so there are like very senior people now willing to admit something. And look, man, I'm not here to pretend like I know it's easy for me to say. And I also go, I think this is a different kind of moment that is happening now. That things are falling apart. Really they are. And maybe they will be held together by the rich and powerful. Maybe it will end up in the hands of even fewer people, and we'll end up in this devastatingly unequal world, and we'll have to, and what you're doing with Urban MBA will be equipping people to be able to best fight on the margins of that and survive. And in which case, more power to you. Maybe though, and I don't want to, just to invite you into that possibility, maybe we can shift and open those folks' minds, and we can create something different. And in that case, what Urban MBA will be doing is it'll be making ready the people who are going to be part of those conversations about how the whole thing should work. Yeah, absolutely. And either way, the work you're doing is the work. And I admire you hugely for it.
Well, that wills us to be, and I would say thank you. If there was one closing thing that you could say about positivity to give to people about what's maybe going to happen or how we can get, what would that be as a closing statement, Jon?
I think the thing I would encourage people to do is to look for these stories of collective action, and look back through history, look around you in your community, and know that like finding each other and spending time in community is the most important thing you could do right now. And know that it isn't just a cute thing. It's not just a sweet thing to do. It will either be the thing that makes us most resilient as things get harder, or it will be the thing that prepares us to step into meaningful power. Either way, the most positive thing you can do right now is develop deeper relationships with your friends and your neighbors and the people around you, and learn.
That makes a lot of sense. So I just want to say thank you so much.